When the mind becomes still, it is like a calm lake, clear, undisturbed, reflecting only truth. But when the lake is stirred again and again by unnecessary words, even the clearest water turns muddy. There are questions that do not bring wisdom. There are questions that do not bring peace. And there are questions that once answered only create more suffering in the mind that receives them. There is a kind of silence that protects the heart, and there are questions that break that silence. The first question is the one that pulls you into the past again and again. Why did they do this to me? At first it seems innocent. It feels like understanding. But notice how it behaves inside the mind. It does not end with an answer. It multiplies anger, replays pain, and builds stories that keep the wound alive. The past cannot be rewritten through repetition. When you keep asking this, you are not seeking truth, you are feeding resentment. Peace does not grow in soil of repeated blame. Sometimes letting go of the question is wiser than solving it. The second question is the one that compares. Why do others have more than me? This question appears dressed as curiosity, but underneath it lies dissatisfaction. It turns your gaze outward until your own blessings become invisible. The mind that constantly measures life against others forgets its own path. Comparison is a thief that does not enter the house by force, it is invited by attention. When you answer this question, you often lose gratitude without gaining anything real in return. The third question is the one that tries to control the future. What if everything goes wrong? This question creates thousands of imagined troubles, most of which never arrive. The mind begins living in shadows that do not exist. Fear grows not from reality, but from rehearsed uncertainty. When you keep answering this question, you begin to suffer in advance. It is like carrying burdens for a journey that may never happen. Peace cannot survive where imagination is used as a tool of fear. The fourth question is the one that seeks validation from others. Do they approve of me? At first it seems like social awareness, but slowly it becomes dependence. The mind begins to bend like grass in every direction of opinion. Approval becomes a fragile foundation for identity. When approval is gained, peace rises briefly. When it is lost, peace collapses. A mind built on external approval is never stable because it is always waiting outside itself for permission to be calm. The fifth question is the most subtle. What is wrong with me? This question appears as self-reflection, but when repeated without care, it becomes self-judgment. It turns awareness into criticism. Instead of understanding yourself, you begin dividing yourself good and bad, worthy and unworthy. A mind constantly searching for flaws forgets to see wholeness. Growth does not come from self-attack, it comes from clear seeing without hatred. These 5 questions are not dangerous because they exist. They are dangerous because of how often they are entertained. Every unnecessary answer becomes a seed. And seeds, once planted in attention, grow into habits of thought. Some habits grow into restlessness, some into fear, some into quiet suffering that has no clear name. Peace is not only found in what you think, it is also found in what you stop thinking. There is wisdom in restraint, not only in action, but in inquiry. Not every question deserves full attention. Not every thought deserves continuation. The mind becomes strong not by answering everything, but by knowing what to leave unanswered. Observe carefully. When you stop feeding certain questions, silence does not feel empty. It feels clean, and in that cleanliness, clarity arises naturally. You begin to see life without distortion. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to rest in awareness instead of being pulled into mental noise. A peaceful life is not created by collecting more answers. It is created by removing unnecessary disturbance. Like a lamp that shines brighter when the glass is clean, the mind becomes luminous when it is not constantly clouded by repetitive questioning. So when these 5 questions appear, do not rush to answer them. Watch them as passing thoughts. Let them come and let them go. Not every invitation from the mind needs attendance. Some questions disturb inner peace instead of creating understanding. Repeating certain thoughts keeps the mind restless rather than helping it find clarity. When certain questions arise in the mind, they may appear harmless at first, even useful, but their repeated presence slowly begins to disturb the natural stillness within. The question of why did this happen to me or similar reflections on the past often feel like an attempt to understand life, yet in reality it frequently becomes a loop that traps awareness in what can no longer be changed. The mind, instead of moving forward, keeps returning to the same moments again and again, replaying emotions, reshaping memories, and adding interpretations that were never present in the original experience. With each repetition, the emotional weight does not reduce but increases, like a stone that becomes heavier the longer it is carried. What begins as curiosity turns into mental restlessness, and what begins as reflection turns into disturbance. Peace is not disturbed by events themselves, but by the continuous mental engagement with them long after they have passed. When attention is repeatedly directed towards such questions, clarity becomes clouded, and the present moment loses its brightness. The mind forgets that understanding does not always require continuous questioning. Sometimes understanding arises in silence where no further explanation is needed. The past, when revisited without wisdom, becomes not a teacher but a prison, holding awareness in places that no longer exist. Each time the question is answered mentally, a new layer of interpretation is added, and this layering creates confusion rather than relief. Over time, the individual begins to identify with the pain being examined, strengthening emotional attachment to what was meant to be released. In this way, the question itself becomes more powerful than the event it refers to. True peace begins when the cycle of unnecessary inquiry is gently observed and then released. This does not mean rejecting understanding, but recognizing when understanding has already reached its natural limit. There is a subtle strength in allowing certain questions to dissolve without pursuit, like letting ripples settle naturally on water instead of disturbing them further. When attention is no longer repeatedly given to what cannot be changed, energy returns to the present moment where life is actually unfolding. In that present space, clarity does not need repetition, and awareness does not need justification. The mind becomes lighter, not because answers were found, but because unnecessary questioning was allowed to end. Constantly revisiting the past through "why did this happen to me?" increases suffering. This kind of questioning fuels anger and prevents emotional healing. The habit of comparing oneself with others often begins quietly, almost unnoticed, as a simple observation of how different lives appear on the surface. Yet when this observation turns into repeated questioning, such as why others have more, why others seem happier, or why others appear more successful, the mind slowly enters a state of inner imbalance. At first, it feels like motivation, as if understanding differences might lead to improvement. But with time, this pattern shifts into dissatisfaction that has no clear endpoint. The attention that is constantly directed outward begins to weaken the appreciation of one's own path, and what once felt enough starts to feel incomplete. The mind forgets that every life unfolds through different conditions, timing, and unseen struggles that cannot be measured accurately from the outside. Comparison creates an illusion that life is a competition being judged on visible outcomes, when in reality each experience carries its own unique journey that cannot be fairly measured against another. When the question, "why do others have more than me?" is repeatedly entertained, it does not produce clarity but instead generates emotional distance from one's present reality. The blessings that already exist begin to feel ordinary, and sometimes even invisible, because attention is constantly drawn toward what is lacking. This shift in perception creates a subtle form of suffering where peace is reduced not by loss but by dissatisfaction with what is already present. The mind becomes trained to scan outward rather than inward, and in doing so it loses connection with gratitude. Gratitude is not a passive feeling, it is a state of awareness that recognizes value in what is already here without needing comparison to confirm it. When comparison becomes a habit, gratitude weakens naturally, and the emotional center of stability begins to fluctuate. Even achievements that once brought joy begin to feel insufficient because they are measured against constantly shifting external standards. Over time, this creates a cycle where satisfaction is always delayed, never fully experienced. True peace emerges when attention is gently returned to one's own life without the need for constant measurement against others. This does not mean ignoring growth or learning, but rather removing the emotional disturbance created by comparison. When the mind stops asking questions that depend on others' lives for answers, it begins to settle into its own rhythm. In that settling, a quiet sense of enoughness arises, not because everything is perfect, but because the need to constantly evaluate life through others has softened. Comparison with others destroys gratitude and inner satisfaction. Asking why others have more shifts focus away from one's own blessings and path. The mind has a powerful tendency to move beyond the present moment and create entire worlds of possibility, especially when it is driven by uncertainty. One of the most common patterns of this movement appears in the question, "what if everything goes wrong?" At first, it may seem like preparation, a way of staying alert or protecting oneself from future difficulty. But when this question is repeatedly entertained, it becomes less about preparation and more about imagination being used in a fearful direction. The mind begins to construct scenarios that have no grounding in reality, and each imagined situation carries emotional weight as if it were already happening. In this way, suffering is experienced not because something has occurred, but because it has been mentally rehearsed. The present moment, which is the only place where life actually exists, becomes overshadowed by countless possibilities that may never take form. This constant projection into the future weakens the natural stability of awareness, making it difficult to rest in what is actually happening right now. Fear grows silently in such patterns, not from events themselves, but from repeated internal visualization of those events. The body may remain in safety, yet the mind behaves as if danger is already present. This creates a split between reality and imagination, where emotional energy is consumed by experiences that are not real. Over time, this habit can lead to chronic anxiety as the mind becomes conditioned to expect difficulty before it arrives. Even neutral situations begin to feel uncertain because the mind has trained itself to search for possible outcomes that do not yet exist. In this state, peace becomes fragile, dependent on temporary reassurance rather than inner clarity. However, when awareness begins to notice this pattern, something important changes. It becomes possible to see that the question itself is not harmful, but the continuous engagement with it is what creates disturbance. When the question arises and is not followed, it loses its power to expand into fear-based stories. The mind learns that not every possibility deserves attention, and not every imagined future needs emotional participation. As this understanding deepens, attention slowly returns to the present moment where life is not hypothetical but real and immediate. In that present, stability is not created by controlling the future but by releasing unnecessary mental projections about it. Peace begins to grow naturally when imagination is no longer dominated by fear but allowed to rest in simplicity. Fear-based future thinking creates imaginary problems. What if everything goes wrong? Leads to anxiety over events that may never happen. The need for approval from others often enters the mind in a very subtle way, not as a loud demand but as a quiet concern about how one is perceived. The question, do they approve of me, may seem natural in social life because human beings are connected and interact with one another. Yet when this question becomes frequent and begins to shape decisions, thoughts, and even identity, it slowly shifts from simple awareness into dependence. The mind starts to adjust itself according to imagined expectations of others, even when those expectations are not clearly expressed. In this process, inner clarity becomes weaker because attention is no longer rooted in personal understanding but in external response. Approval becomes like a mirror that is constantly being checked, and self-worth begins to depend on what is reflected back. When approval is received, there is temporary relief, a sense of being accepted, valued, or correct. But this feeling does not last long because it is dependent on conditions outside of control. When approval is missing or unclear, the mind quickly shifts into doubt, discomfort, or self-questioning. This creates a cycle where peace is repeatedly interrupted by the changing opinions, moods, and judgments of others. Over time, the individual may begin to lose connection with inner guidance, because decisions are no longer made from clarity but from fear of rejection or desire for acceptance. Even simple actions can become influenced by this pattern as the mind starts asking how it will appear rather than whether it feels right or truthful. This creates an invisible burden where life is continuously filtered through external perception. The natural expression of self becomes restricted, as if constantly being adjusted to fit unseen expectations. Yet approval from others is not stable, it changes with time, situation, and perspective. What is appreciated by one may be ignored by another, and what is accepted today may be questioned tomorrow. If peace depends on something so changeable, it cannot remain steady. When awareness begins to notice this pattern, a shift becomes possible. It becomes clear that the question itself is not the problem, but the importance given to its answer. When attention is no longer fully invested in external validation, a quieter form of confidence begins to emerge. Actions can then arise from understanding rather than approval seeking, and presence becomes more grounded. In that grounded state, interaction with others still exists, but it no longer determines inner stability. Peace no longer waits for confirmation, it begins to exist independently within awareness itself. Self-doubt and need for approval weaken inner stability. Overthinking what is wrong with me, or seeking constant validation from others, breaks inner confidence and peace. The question, what is wrong with me, often appears in the mind during moments of confusion, failure, or emotional discomfort. At first glance, it may seem like a form of honest self-reflection, as if the mind is trying to identify areas that need improvement. But when this question is repeated without balance or awareness, it gradually turns inward in a way that creates division within the self. Instead of observing experiences with clarity, the mind begins to search for flaws, as if the entire self must be corrected or fixed. This constant searching for what is wrong does not bring true understanding. Rather, it creates a subtle pressure that makes the individual feel incomplete even in moments of stability. The focus shifts from growth to judgment and from learning to criticism. Over time, this pattern shapes how a person sees themselves, not as a whole being with changing experiences, but as a problem that must always be analyzed. Every mistake begins to feel like evidence of inadequacy, and every challenge becomes a confirmation of internal deficiency. This interpretation is not necessarily accurate, but the repetition of the question makes it feel real. The mind forgets that human experience naturally includes mistakes, learning, change, and uncertainty, and instead begins to interpret imperfection as personal failure. In this state, self-awareness loses its softness and becomes heavy, almost harsh, as if one is constantly standing in judgment of their own existence. Peace becomes difficult to maintain because attention is continuously directed toward correction rather than acceptance. However, true understanding does not arise from constant self-criticism. It arises from clear observation without hostility. When the question is asked with compassion, it can lead to insight, but when it is repeated with emotional pressure, it creates fragmentation. The self begins to feel divided between what it is and what it thinks it should be. This division is where unnecessary suffering grows. When awareness begins to notice this pattern, something important shifts. The question can still arise, but it no longer needs to be taken as a final truth. Instead of immediately searching for faults, the mind can observe experiences as they are, without rushing to label them as wrong or right. In that space, understanding becomes lighter and more natural. The sense of being broken or incomplete begins to dissolve, not because perfection is achieved, but because the need to constantly judge the self has softened. In this way, peace is restored not through correction, but through gentler awareness.